Hey guys, tonight we step into a world you probably wouldn't want to live in, though it might just help you drift off to sleep. Picture yourself standing in a drafty stone castle, torches flickering along cold walls, and someone casually points out the bathroom. You expect a door, a seat, maybe even some privacy, but instead you're led to a hole in the wall with the winter wind rushing up from below. And you think, yep, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander through the corridors of that medieval castle, heavy stones pressing down with centuries of history. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, damp moss, and something less pleasant you can't quite place yet. Eventually, you stumble across a narrow alcove with a simple stone bench, a hole carved right into it. That, apparently, is the king's private restroom. Except it isn't very private. The opening drops straight down the outside wall of the castle, where the waste piles up below, creating what must have been the least glamorous moat in history. You can imagine the enemy storming the walls, dodging arrows, only to realize they're also dodging something far worse. The medieval toilet, known as the garderobe, was less of a room and more of a crude solution. Some historians even note the word comes from the idea of storing clothes there, because supposedly the ammonia rising from waste killed fleas. That means the same space people used was also where they might hang their cloaks. Think about slipping into your tunic the next morning with just a hint of eau de latrine clinging to it. Not exactly the fragrance of victory. And here's a fun, or maybe horrifying, historical fact. Archaeologists digging beneath medieval castles sometimes find fossilized waste still preserved after centuries. They've actually studied these samples to figure out medieval diets. Lots of bread, grains, and occasionally parasites. Scholars still argue whether people in those days accepted parasites as normal or if they were just too resigned to complain. Either way, you're imagining all of this while perched on a stone seat with no cushion, no privacy, and no flushing handle to save you. The cold, of course, doesn't help. Picture winter in northern Europe. Outside, snow piles against the castle walls. Inside, your breath fogs the air. And when you sit down on the stone bench, the chill runs straight through you. The experience is less about relief and more about survival. You probably don't linger. You go in, you get out, and you hope you don't slip on the frozen stones in the process. And then there's the sound. The hollow drop echoing down a chute carved into the castle wall. Not exactly soothing. Add to that the faint hum of flies in warmer months, the distant trickle of waste mixing with rainwater, and maybe a guard outside the door who can hear everything. Privacy? Forget it. Medieval toilets were as public as a marketplace, only without the bread stalls. Imagine, too, that you're a guest in the castle. You're trying to look noble, dignified, maybe impress the lord of the manor. But at some point, nature calls, and you're directed to the garderobe. You perch there nervously, cloak tucked up, praying no one walks past the outer wall and looks up at exactly the wrong moment. Some garderobes actually jutted out over courtyards or streams, so anyone below got more than they bargained for. The strange thing is this was considered advanced. Many peasants out in the countryside had nothing at all, just a pit in the ground or the edge of a field under the stars. So when you sit in that cold, echoing stone chamber, you're technically experiencing luxury. Medieval luxury, which, translated into modern terms, means barely tolerable discomfort. Picture yourself wandering back through the castle corridor afterward, relieved but a little shaken. The fire in the great hall feels warmer. The roasted meat on the table smells richer. But somewhere in the back of your mind, you can't forget the draft that snuck up from that dark hole. You realize that for all the glory of knights and kings, for all the songs of battles and feasts, everyone, royal or servant, still had to deal with the same problem, and the solutions weren't exactly elegant. You might wonder, did anyone try to make it nicer? Scholars still argue whether some castles experimented with herb bundles or perfumed cloths near the toilet areas. Archaeological traces of lavender, mint, and juniper berries suggest people at least tried to mask the smell. Imagine sitting there with sprigs of rosemary tucked into the wall, convincing yourself it smelled like a garden instead of a sewer. But really, you couldn't escape it. Waste piled up outside, sometimes attracting rats, which scampered right back into the castle. The garderobe wasn't sealed off, so while you sit in your royal chamber wrapped in furs, you might hear the faint scratching of little claws behind the walls. Nothing says good night like the sound of vermin making themselves at home in the refuse chute. And so you start to settle into the rhythm of medieval life. You walk past guards polishing armor, women carrying baskets of bread, children chasing dogs across the hall. Everything looks noble on the surface, but once you've experienced the garderobe, you realize how much of that world was built on holding your breath and hoping the draft doesn't freeze your skin to the stone seat. This is just the beginning. The medieval toilet world stretches far beyond castle walls, into villages, towns, monasteries, even ships at sea. But here, in this cold stone chamber, you've had your first real taste, not of roasted venison or spiced wine, but of the one reality everyone shared. No matter how high your rank, you still had to face the worst seat in the house. And as you drift in that thought, the torches flicker lower, shadows stretch across the hall, and the hum of the castle quiets down. You imagine yourself wrapped in a wool cloak, lying on a straw mattress, grateful you don't have to climb out to the garderobe again tonight. The cold, the draft, the echoing drop, they'll still be there tomorrow. But for now, you let your eyes close, knowing the worst seat of medieval life is only part one of this sleepy little journey. You step further into the castle, moving away from the torchlight of the great hall, and the air cools as you climb winding staircases and narrow passages. The stone feels damp beneath your hand, and the draft cuts through your cloak like a knife. You've been told the Lord's private garderobe is up here, tucked against the outer wall. You wonder if that's because it's exclusive, or simply because it's the furthest corner no one wants to walk near. Either way, you climb until your legs ache, and then you find it. A lonely little room jutting out from the side of the fortress, a chamber exposed to the chill of the night. The first thing that hits you is the cold. No fireplaces here. No braziers filled with glowing coals. Just bare stone, open air, and the bitter draft seeping through cracks. You sit down, and your body tenses instantly. Stone is not a forgiving seat. If you thought sitting in a modern waiting room chair was uncomfortable, try a block of rock in January. Your thighs might as well be resting on ice. And you realize this wasn't just your problem. Every knight, every lady of the manor, every guest who stepped into that space had to clench their teeth and brace for the shock. And here's a historical fact to chew on while you shiver. Castles were notorious for being cold. Scholars still argue whether tapestries and heavy curtains truly helped insulate rooms, or whether they just made people feel a little cozier, while drafts continued to sweep under doors. Imagine then the place that was least important to decorate, the toilet chamber. If the banquet hall had velvet drapes, the garderobe had bare,
freezing walls. Now picture a windy night. Outside, the storm rattles the shutters. Rain lashes against the stone. You creep into the garderobe, clutching a candle, only to have the flame gutter out as a gust blows through the chute. You're left in near darkness, perched over a hollow that carries not only air, but sound. The echoes from the storm mingle with the hollow whistle from the shaft below. It feels less like a bathroom and more like some cursed cave. You don't linger. You get the job done quickly and retreat to the warmth of the hall, shaking your head at how something so basic could be so punishing. And of course, castles weren't built with comfort in mind. They were fortresses, defensive structures meant to withstand sieges. Waste disposal was almost an afterthought. So when you imagine a knight in shining armor, his plumed helmet glinting in the torchlight, remember he too had to step into these drafty little chambers, balancing carefully on a stone hole, all while trying not to freeze his behind off. Oddly enough, some garderobes were placed high up the walls, letting the waste fall directly into moats below. You've probably pictured moats as sparkling waters surrounding the fortress, but in reality, they often turned into foul ditches. Not exactly the romantic image of medieval castles Disney sold us. Standing on that stone bench with the cold air rushing upward, you can practically hear the faint splash in the darkness below, and you quickly realize why moat water was never meant for swimming. You think about how the smell must have carried in summer. In winter, it was the cold that bit your skin. In the warmer months, the scent must have crept back up the shaft, greeting anyone who dared to sit too long. Scholars still argue whether herbs placed nearby made a difference, or if the foul stench simply overpowered every attempt. But you don't need a PhD to know the truth. You just wrinkle your nose and hurry along. Now consider the people who had to clean these spaces, because yes, someone always did. Servants, often the lowest ranking in the household, were tasked with scraping out refuse that built up at the base of castle walls. Imagine trudging down to the moat with a wooden shovel, standing knee-deep in mud and worse, scooping piles of waste into carts. No knightly glory there, just stink, sweat, and the faint hope of getting the job over with before dinner. But as you sit in that freezing alcove, maybe you find a tiny bit of gratitude. After all, at least you had a space set aside for this. Out in the villages, most people had to make do with fields or ditches. The castle, drafty as it was, still offered a bench, walls, and even sometimes a wooden door. Thin comfort, yes, but comfort all the same. Your candle flickers again as another gust whips through the chute. You hold it close, shielding the flame, and picture how many before you did the same. Lords, ladies, weary knights, and nervous guests, all huddled here, shivering, waiting for the ordeal to pass. You almost laugh at the thought of some powerful baron feared across the land, perched awkwardly on a stone bench just like you. Suddenly, everyone feels equal. Thrones may have been golden in the great hall, but here the throne was made of cold rock, and it humbled everyone who used it. And as you finish your business and stand, stretching your stiff legs, you hear the faint howl of the wind outside. It rattles through the tower, carrying away the evidence of your visit. You step out into the corridor, grateful for the torchlight and the faint warmth of passing servants. The garderobe fades into the shadows behind you, but its memory lingers. A reminder that in the grand castles of Europe, luxury had its limits. The irony, of course, is that these drafty latrines were supposed to be improvements. better than pits in the ground, better than chamber pots in bedrooms. They represented progress. Yet as you walk back toward the hall, rubbing your chilled hands together, you know that progress can still be miserable. And so the castle whispers its lesson. Glory and grandeur on the outside, discomfort in the details. You imagine crawling into bed tonight, straw mattress under your back, heavy wool blankets piled high, listening to the faint hum of the wind outside. Somewhere in the dark, the garderobe waits. But for now, you're warm, you're safe, and you can close your eyes knowing you survived one more cold visit to the worst seat in the house.
You've made it through the cold stone chamber, but the name itself still lingers in your mind. Garde-robe. It sounds elegant, almost French, doesn't it? Like something you'd expect in a palace filled with silks and perfumes. You might even imagine a wardrobe stuffed with gowns and cloaks, or maybe a private dressing chamber where a lady adjusts her jewelry. But the truth? The medieval garde-robe was the ultimate bait and switch. Fancy word, nasty reality. You wander through another corridor, noticing that the door to the garde-robe is often nothing more than a wooden plank on iron hinges. If you're lucky, it has a latch. If not, well, privacy is whatever your fellow castle residents choose to give you. Step inside, and you're met with the same bare bench, the same gaping hole, the same draft rushing upward like a ghost with unfinished business. And you think, how did something with such a refined name become one of the least refined places in history? The answer lies in language. Garde-robe literally translates as guarding the robes. In some castles, people would hang their cloaks in these little chambers, believing the rising ammonia fumes would kill off lice and fleas. A practical thought, maybe, but not exactly appealing. You can picture yourself returning from a chilly walk along the battlements, slipping on your woolen cloak and realizing it smells faintly like, well, exactly what was going on in the garde-robe below. Congratulations, you're now wrapped in medieval pest control. And here's a quirky historical fact for you. Archaeologists excavating ancient garde-robes have actually found remains of cloth, food scraps, and even jewelry dropped by accident. Apparently, when you balance over a hole in the floor with layers of robes around you, losing a belt buckle or ring isn't uncommon. Scholars still argue whether medieval nobles considered these accidents minor annoyances or full-blown disasters. Imagine dropping your silver brooch down the chute and realizing it's gone forever, unless you're desperate enough to dig through what's piling up at the bottom. Probably not worth it. But the garde-robe wasn't only about filth. It was also about symbolism. Castles weren't just homes, they were power statements. So even their toilets needed names that sounded dignified. No lord wanted to admit he had a hole in the wall. He had a garde-robe, a chamber, a private retreat. The kind of place you could mention with a straight face at dinner, even if everyone knew what it really was. You step closer to the stone bench and run your hand across the surface. Smooth from centuries of use, cold as ever, it tells its own story. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people have sat here, robes rustling, cloaks pulled close, each one thinking, for a brief moment, that they were in a private chamber shielded from the world. But in reality, they were sitting over a chute that opened right onto the outside wall. Birds nested in the crevices, rats scurried along the edges, and the air carried everything back upward. So much for privacy, so much for elegance. Now, picture the garde-robe at night. A single candle flickers, shadows stretching across the walls. You hear footsteps echoing through the corridor outside, someone walking past. The latch rattles. You cough politely, hoping they take the hint, but there's always the chance they simply pushed the door open anyway. After all, locks weren't standard, and in a busy castle with dozens of residents, patience was limited. So you sit there, half frozen, praying the door doesn't swing wide. Not exactly the relaxing retreat the word garde-robe promised. And the smell, let's not forget that. In summer, the shaft became a chimney of stench. Warm air carried the odor back inside, filling the tiny chamber. Imagine stepping in, trying to breathe through your mouth, only to find it doesn't help. The stink seeps into everything, your clothes, your hair, even your skin. You walk back to the hall afterward, and maybe no one says anything, but they know. Everyone knows. The garde-robe has marked you. Of course, medieval people had different standards. Compared to the open pits of villages or the crude outhouses of towns, a garde-robe was a step up. It was indoors, sheltered, and sometimes even equipped with a small window for ventilation. You can imagine leaning toward that window, gulping fresh air, while at the same time hoping you don't drop your candle, or worse, yourself. The chamber wasn't exactly spacious. One wrong move, and you might find yourself much closer to the moat than you ever wanted. Scholars still argue whether garde-robes doubled as hiding spots during sieges. Some castle designs included chutes that theoretically could serve as escape routes, though the thought of crawling down a shaft used daily as a latrine isn't exactly heroic. Imagine yourself as a desperate knight, armor clanking, lowering yourself into the chute, only to slip and fall into the moat. If the enemy didn't get you, the humiliation surely would. And yet, for all its flaws, the garde-robe was a fixture of medieval life. Every castle had them. Some had dozens, tucked into towers, hidden behind walls, perched above streams. They were as much a part of the architecture as the Great Hall or the chapel. Which means every noble banquet, every knightly tournament, every royal feast was followed inevitably by a procession of people heading to the same cold, stinking little chamber, the garde-robe, the great equalizer. You sit for a moment longer, imagining the voices of the past drifting through the walls, laughter from the hall, music from the minstrels, the clatter of goblets against wooden tables, and then the awkward shuffle of someone waiting outside the door, clearing their throat, reminding you that you're not the only one who needs the chamber tonight. You sigh, gather your cloak, and step back into the corridor, leaving behind the fancy-named, foul-smelling, unforgettable room. As you walk away, you can't help but chuckle. Garde-robe, a word that once sounded noble, now forever linked in your mind with drafts, smells, and the risk of losing your jewelry to the abyss. It's a reminder that language can dress up anything, even the most unpleasant parts of life. And as you head back toward the warmth of the fire, you realize this castle is full of such contrasts: glory and grime, elegance and discomfort, dignity, and the most undignified reality of all. You leave behind the garde-robe's fancy name and chilly stone seat, and now the castle grows quiet. Night has fallen. The feasting hall echoes the last strums of a lute. Servants snuff out torches one by one, and the corridors fall into shadow. This is when another challenge appears: the nighttime toilet run. Imagine yourself lying on a straw mattress stuffed with hay, scratchy wool blankets pulled over your shoulders. The room is drafty, but at least warmer than the garde-robe. You're half asleep, dreaming of roast meat and mead, when suddenly your stomach rumbles with less than romantic urgency. You groan. It's midnight. The garde-robe is halfway across the castle, up 2 staircases, past a guard who definitely doesn't want to move for you.
And so you face the medieval solution, the chamber pot. You sit up, feet touching the cold stone floor. There it is, tucked under the bed, a simple clay or wooden bowl. It doesn't sparkle, it doesn't flush, it's just waiting for its moment. You drag it out, trying not to wake anyone in the room, because yes, privacy isn't guaranteed here either. In noble households, whole families or groups of servants often slept in the same chamber. That means your midnight relief is accompanied by the sound of someone else snoring 3 feet away. Romantic, isn't it? And here's a historical fact to ground the scene. Chamber pots were a staple of every social class in medieval Europe. Archaeologists have uncovered them in castles, monasteries, and humble cottages alike. Scholars still argue whether people emptied them diligently each morning or let them linger until absolutely necessary. Either way, you don't have the luxury of waiting right now. You clutch a candle, shadows dancing across the walls as you lower yourself onto the pot. The sound echoes far louder than you hoped. Someone stirs in the corner. You freeze, holding your breath, praying they don't sit up and give you a disapproving glare. After all, manners mattered, even at night. No one wanted to be that person who woke the room with their chamber pot symphony. Once you're done, you slide the pot carefully back beneath the bed, promising yourself you'll empty it in the morning. But tomorrow morning is always someone else's problem, isn't it? You roll back under the blankets, trying to forget the faint smell drifting up, mixing with the smoke of the dying hearth fire. Not exactly lavender-scented sleep, but it will do. Of course, the chamber pot wasn't without its awkward moments. Imagine being a guest in someone's castle, politely shown to your bed in the guest chamber. You nod, smile, thank your host. Hours later, nature calls. You search under the bed, nothing. So you improvise. A jug? A bowl? The fireplace corner? Let's just say medieval cleanliness rules were flexible at best. You can picture a servant's annoyance in the morning when they discover your improvisation. No one writes songs about that part of chivalry. And sometimes the chamber pot made public appearances. Picture a banquet stretching late into the night, golubs clinking, laughter booming, and wine flowing endlessly. Eventually, someone discreetly excuses themselves, not to the distant guard-robe, but to a pot waiting behind a screen in the corner of the hall. You keep eating while pretending not to notice. Everyone knows what's happening, but no one mentions it. Welcome to medieval subtlety. Oddly enough, some chamber pots were decorated. Archaeologists have found examples with painted designs, even inscriptions. Imagine lifting the lid and reading a cheeky Latin phrase. Humor where you least expect it. Scholars still argue whether these were meant as jokes, status symbols, or just attempts to make the inevitable a little less miserable. Either way, you can't help but chuckle as you think of some nobleman, tipsy from wine, laughing as he uses his fancy pot. Now picture the servant's role. At dawn, when the rooster crows and the castle stirs, it's someone's duty to collect, carry, and empty those pots. Dozens of them, from every chamber. Picture trudging down the stone steps with a heavy, sloshing load, trying not to spill, hoping no one bumps into you. The courtyard fills with the smell of morning waste before anyone's even had breakfast. Not the kind of alarm clock you want. Yet, for all the awkwardness, the chamber pot was practical. No one wanted to walk through freezing corridors in the middle of the night. No one wanted to climb towers by candlelight just to reach the guard-robe. And so, night after night, people relied on those humble little bowls, quietly making history one midnight moment at a time. You curl back under the blankets, listening to the muffled snores around you. The chamber pot sits beneath the bed, a silent companion. The wind howls outside, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the darkness, a guard's footsteps echo against the courtyard stones. Life in the castle goes on, with all its grandeur and all its humbling realities. And as you drift toward sleep, you realize something. The medieval world was full of challenges, wars, famine, cold winters, but sometimes the smallest struggles tell the biggest truths. Even the mightiest knight, the noblest lady, the wealthiest lord, all of them shared this simple ritual.
At night, when the castle slept, they too reached for the chamber pot, praying no one woke to hear them. The thought lingers as your eyes grow heavy. The chamber pot, humble yet universal, reminds you that behind all the armor and ceremony, people were just people. And as the last candle sputters out, leaving you in the dark, you let yourself sink into sleep, knowing that the awkwardness of nighttime relief is part of what makes history so human. You've seen the public privies of the town, noisy and crowded, and trudged back to the castle with the faint feeling that your nose may never recover. But tonight, as you wander the chilly halls again, you start thinking about the bigger picture. What did people in the Middle Ages actually believe about hygiene? Did they even care? You lean against a rough stone wall, listening to the wind outside, and the question settles in like a draft. Hygiene myths versus the grimy truth. You've probably heard the stereotype that medieval people never bathed, that they walked around caked in filth, and that the smell of humanity must have hung in the air like a fog. And yes, there's truth there, but also exaggeration. The reality, as usual, was messier. Fact first, baths did exist. Towns had bathhouses, sometimes even multiple ones, where you could pay a fee, step inside a steaming room, and sink into warm water. These weren't just for the wealthy. Ordinary townsfolk used them too. Hot water was heated in great cauldrons, poured into wooden tubs, and mixed with herbs to give at least the illusion of cleanliness. But here's the odd detail. Bathhouses doubled as social spots, and sometimes as fronts for less wholesome activities. Scholars still argue whether medieval bathing was primarily about health or about, well, pleasure. Either way, the church eventually frowned on them, and bathhouses slowly declined. You picture yourself stepping into one on a chilly evening. The air is thick with steam, voices echo off wooden walls, and water sloshes as people laugh, talk, and relax. For a moment, you almost forget the grimness of the privies. But then you remember that the water wasn't always changed as often as it should have been. If you were unlucky, you were sharing not only warmth, but also fleas, lice, and germs with everyone else. So maybe after all, that never bathed stereotype wasn't entirely wrong. It was just complicated. People did wash, but not as thoroughly as you might hope. Many preferred to rub themselves down with linen cloths, a kind of dry cleaning for the body. Perfumes and scented oils helped mask odors. Imagine yourself dabbing rose water behind your ears, hoping no one notices that you haven't truly scrubbed in weeks. It's more cover-up than cure. Now let's connect this to toilets. If you're already dealing with waste in public privies, if chamber pots are being tossed into the street, then bathing becomes more of a losing battle. You might wash your hands after using a garderobe, but without soap as we know it, washing might just mean dipping your fingers in cold water and shaking them dry. You wrinkle your nose again. No wonder the air in the medieval town was thick with smells. Here's a quirky little image for you. Tooth care. Instead of toothbrushes, people chewed herbs or rubbed ashes on their teeth. Mouths carried their own odor, adding to the overall atmosphere. Combine that with the smell of the privy, the livestock, and the bathhouse steam, and you've got yourself an olfactory symphony you can't escape. Some people, of course, cared more. Nobles sprinkled their rooms with herbs and flowers to cover the smell of waste wafting up from the garderobes. Rosemary, lavender, and mint weren't just pleasant, they were survival tools. You wander through a noble's chamber, breathe in the scent of herbs strewn on the floor, and for a moment you're fooled. Then the wind shifts, and you catch the bitter tang of the latrine shaft hidden in the wall. The herbs never really win. And scholars, well, they still argue about how dirty medieval people truly were. Some point out the existence of bathhouses, herbal remedies, and surprisingly detailed medical texts. Others emphasize the cesspits, chamber pots, and plague outbreaks. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. People tried, but the tools they had weren't enough to overcome the sheer tide of waste and disease. Think of medieval clothing for a second. Multiple layers of wool, linen, sometimes fur. These weren't washed often either. Laundering was laborious, and water didn't come out of pipes at the turn of a tap. It had to be hauled bucket by bucket. So even if you did wash your body, you were slipping back into clothes that hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks. You shift uncomfortably, tugging at your sleeve, suddenly aware of just how itchy and sticky that would feel. Even in monasteries, where order and discipline were prized, hygiene was a challenge. Monks had rules about washing hands and faces before prayers, but the shared latrines, the necessaria, undermined the effort. A row of wooden seats, a stream below to carry things away, and rows of monks sitting silently, side by side. You stand at the edge of that chamber, watching the cloaked figures, and wonder whether the solemn silence was reverence or just an attempt to ignore the smell. The truth is, cleanliness was relative. If everyone around you smelled the same, you probably didn't think of yourself as filthy. Standards shift when no one has mint toothpaste, when soap is rare, and privies are communal. You breathe out slowly, imagining yourself settling onto that cold wooden seat again, realizing that for them, this was normal. And yet, people did notice smells. They wrote complaints about cesspits overflowing, about neighbors who didn't clean their waste properly, about foul-smelling streets. It wasn't that they didn't care, it's that their tools to fix the problem were so limited. Without sewers, without modern soap, without plumbing, every attempt was a losing battle. You stroll out into the castle courtyard now, taking a deep breath of cold night air. The smell is fresher here, though faint traces of waste linger around the moat. You pull your cloak tighter and tilt your head to the stars. If you're honest, the myth of the dirty medieval world is both right and wrong. They tried in their own ways. Herbs, perfumes, linen wipes, bathhouses, but against the overwhelming stench of garderobes, chamber pots, and public privies, their efforts were like candles in a storm. You smile faintly because this isn't just history, it's a reminder of perspective. Someday, maybe centuries from now, people will look back at us and laugh at our own hygiene quirks. They'll say, "Can you believe they used hand sanitizer and thought it was enough?" And maybe, just maybe, someone will wrinkle their nose at the memory of our world, the way you now wrinkle yours at theirs. For now, you tuck that thought away, slip down a quiet corridor, and head toward the garderobe. A thin draft meets you at the doorway. The smell, familiar now, isn't quite as shocking as it once was. Maybe you're getting used to it. Or maybe, just like the people who lived here centuries ago, you've accepted that when it comes to hygiene, the truth is always messier than the myth.
You've wandered through castles, town streets, and monastery halls, and now your thoughts drift toward one of the more physically awkward challenges of medieval life: clothes. Not just any clothes, but the elaborate layers that medieval people wore daily. You stand before a dresser, imagining yourself pulling on a linen shirt, a wool tunic, a heavy cloak, and perhaps even a fur-lined coat if the season demanded it. Every garment adds warmth, yes, but it also adds complexity when nature calls. And this is where toilet struggles meet fashion in the most inconvenient ways. You fumble with a belt clasp. The fabric is stiff from months of use and infrequent washing. The wool scratches against your skin. You finally reach the garderobe, perch carefully, and realize that maneuvering around multiple layers is a skill in itself.
There's a rhythm to it, a careful choreography that only centuries of experience could teach. Scholars still argue whether nobles trained their children in these skills, or if people simply learned by trial, error, and occasional embarrassment. Either way, one false tug could ruin your clothing, or worse, send you slipping off the cold stone bench entirely. Think about the sheer bulk of the robes. The more important you were, the more layers you wore, the heavier the garments, and the more elaborate the fastenings. Buttons, ties, laces, brooches, belts, all had to be undone in a precise order. You imagine yourself mid-performance, balancing over a hole while wrangling 3 layers of wool, a leather belt, and a decorative sash. You can almost hear the clatter of metal fastenings as you struggle. Not exactly the dignified moment a knight or lady might have hoped for. And then there's the matter of skirts and dresses for women. Lengths that trail the floor, fabrics that drag through mud and waste, layers of petticoats and underskirts. Trying to sit gracefully in a garderobe requires skill worthy of a performance stage. You picture a lady carefully lifting folds of fabric, leaning over the stone seat, and hoping the hem doesn't touch anything unspeakable. Scholars still argue whether etiquette manuals truly advised on these moments, or if people simply relied on learned behavior and embarrassment to guide them. Either way, you feel a mix of empathy and relief that you don't have to navigate the full ensemble tonight. Footwear adds another layer of difficulty. Heavy leather boots or pointed shoes limit mobility. Stone floors are cold and unforgiving. One misstep, one slippery patch, and you could find yourself sprawled unceremoniously, exposing more than you intended. You tug at your boots, testing the grip, imagining all the accidents that surely occurred over centuries in castles and townhouses alike. No songs of bravery were sung about such falls, but they happened, often to the proudest of nobles. And let's not forget accessories. Chains, rings, brooches, even weapons might hang from a belt. Medieval fashion could be heavy, cumbersome, and inflexible. You shift awkwardly, imagining yourself trying to reach the chamber pot or sit over a garderobe with all that weight. Each piece of metal clinks against another, a chorus of discomfort. A misstep could tangle chains, pull belts, or, heaven forbid, knock a dagger off its sheath. You sit a little straighter, relieved that your modern clothing offers none of these challenges. Now consider the servants. They often had simpler clothes, yes, but even their linen shirts, woolen trousers, and aprons required careful handling when dealing with chamber pots, garderobes, or cesspits. The irony is rich. Those tasked with cleaning waste had their own cumbersome outfits to navigate, making their job even messier. You watch a servant hauling a bucket down a stone stairwell and think about the countless hours spent juggling clothes and refuse alike. Not glamorous, definitely not romantic. Odd quirks appear too. Some garments were stiffened with wax or treated with oils to give shape or shine. While fashionable, these coatings made movement sticky, especially when you needed flexibility. You picture yourself tugging and wriggling into position, muttering under your breath as the waxy fabric resists every effort. Scholars still argue whether these treatments truly improved hygiene or just added an extra layer of discomfort. Either way, you can imagine medieval frustration firsthand. And then there's the seasonal challenge. In summer, layers could be suffocating. In winter, freezing cold. You're wrapped tightly to stay warm, but that makes bathroom trips more difficult, slower, and more dangerous on icy stone or muddy streets. You imagine yourself hesitating, balancing over a chamber pot or leaning over a garderobe, praying no part of your attire catches on the bench, the wood, or the wall. Even the most skilled nobles probably had accidents. The thought makes you smirk and also appreciate modern zippers. You notice a small detail. Buttons and laces often doubled as status symbols. Nobles showed off their wealth through intricate designs, precious metals, and embroidered patterns. But these symbols didn't stop you from fumbling with fabric while perched over the worst seat in history. They just made the fall, literally and metaphorically, more embarrassing. You tug your cloak tighter, feeling the weight of centuries of fashion faux pas pressing down. And as you step away from the garderobe, you notice the continuity of struggle. Castle, town, monastery, clothing adds complexity everywhere. You carry a newfound respect for medieval people who navigated all this daily. Life was uncomfortable in ways modern conveniences have erased. Heavy garments, cold stone, awkward angles, limited privacy. You wandered down the corridor, imagining your ancestors clumsily balancing on the edge of history and hygiene. The final thought lingers. Fashion was supposed to elevate life, but in the toilet chamber, it humbled everyone. No matter your wealth, rank, or status, a slippery hem or stubborn belt could bring you low. You smile faintly, imagining the shared human experience. Nobles and peasants alike, struggling with clothing and nature in equal measure. It's both humbling and oddly comforting to know that in some ways, history's challenges are universal. You leave the chamber with a soft laugh, feeling the layers of history settle over you. You've endured drafts, awkward steps, and cumbersome fashion all in one night's journey. And as you pull the heavy wooden door closed behind you, the cold stone walls echo your quiet chuckle. You move onward, deeper into the story of medieval toilets, knowing that the combination of fashion, draft, and filth made life both human and hilariously difficult. You leave the struggle of cumbersome medieval clothing behind, and now turn your attention to a challenge that even modern imagination finds hard to face: the seasonal extremes of medieval toilets. You step outside the castle, the wind cutting across the ramparts like an icy blade. Snow clings to the stone walls, frost spreads across the narrow staircases, and you shiver just imagining being perched on that stone bench in the middle of a winter night. Castles were notoriously cold in winter. Tapestries and heavy curtains could soften a draft, but garderobes were rarely insulated. The cold stone seats would chill your bones within seconds, and the open shafts let icy wind sweep upward, like a cruel reminder that nature doesn't wait for convenience. Scholars still argue whether the location of these toilets was purely for defense or if the designers hoped cold air would help mask the smell. Either way, you quickly realize that comfort was never a priority. Imagine yourself sitting there, trying to balance warmth and dignity. Your fingers ache from the cold, your legs tremble, and every gust of wind threatens to extinguish your candle. The chill seeps into every layer of your clothing, even the fur-lined cloak you imagined wearing. You realize that part of surviving medieval life meant enduring discomfort that modern humans would consider absurd. A drafty chamber wasn't just inconvenient, it was a test of patience and endurance. In summer, the problem flips entirely. The garderobe becomes a hotbox. The sun beats down on stone walls exposed to the sky, warming them to uncomfortable levels. Combined with the stench of accumulated waste in the shafts below, the chamber becomes almost unbearable. Flies swarm in a dizzying cloud, buzzing in your hair, landing on your arms. Sweat beads on your forehead as you fidget on the stone bench, trying not to think about the heat radiating from the human and animal refuse below. Scholars still debate whether medieval builders considered ventilation a serious concern or just relied on open air to carry the smells away. You, however, are acutely aware that it doesn't work as well as they hoped. And it isn't just the stone that makes summer miserable. Clothing layers still apply, often heavy wool or linen, sometimes even lined with fur for no reason other than status. You tug and lift fabrics, trying to avoid contact with surfaces that have been warmed and made even more odorous by the day's sun. Your cloak sticks uncomfortably to your skin, and you wonder how long people could really endure such conditions without developing some sort of ingenious coping strategy. Rain complicates matters further. Picture a sudden downpour outside. Water seeps through gaps in the walls, drips from ceilings, and splashes into the garderobe if it's exposed. Stone floors become slippery, making every movement precarious. You lean carefully, trying not to lose your balance as you navigate this tiny chamber of medieval peril. Even a small misstep could mean a spill of, well, the unpleasant kind. Humorous in hindsight, terrifying in the moment. Oddly enough, some castles tried to mitigate these extreme conditions. A few had wooden platforms or seats raised slightly off the stone, sometimes even with rudimentary drainage to help keep the area drier. But these improvements were inconsistent. The lucky few experienced only minor discomfort, while the rest faced icy benches or sweltering heat with no relief. You feel a mix of sympathy and disbelief. Humanity has always been inventive, but sometimes ingenuity meets the harsh reality of nature and loses. The social implications of seasonal extremes are fascinating too. Imagine a nobleman being called to the garderobe in the dead of winter. He can't simply wait, he must go, balancing urgency and pride. The servants assisting in cleanup must contend with icy fingers and freezing toes. And in summer, everyone smells worse, flies swarm everywhere, and comfort becomes a memory. Scholars still debate whether medieval etiquette manuals ever truly considered these practical issues, or if they were just assumed to be endured silently. You can easily picture the silent suffering, punctuated by occasional muttered curses. Animals add another layer of complexity. Many garderobes were positioned above moats, or open areas where birds nested. Winter snow or summer sun could send debris into the shaft, complicating the already unpleasant experience. You squint, imagining small creatures interacting with the human waste below, creating an ecosystem that no modern toilet user wants to consider. The thought makes you shiver and laugh at the absurdity of it all. You also notice that these seasonal extremes influenced castle architecture. Towers and outer walls were designed with defense in mind, but the placement of garderobes shows a clear lack of concern for human comfort. Scholars still argue whether this was a deliberate choice to prioritize fortification or simply a matter of tradition and convenience. Either way, you can't help but feel that the cold in winter and the heat in summer were as much a part of the daily challenge as the toilets themselves. And yet, for all this discomfort, people adapted. Clothing layers, positioning strategies, candles to fend off the cold, herbs to mask odors, patience, and even humor helped them survive. You lean back against the stone wall, imagining centuries of people enduring these extremes, quietly enduring discomfort while carrying on with their daily lives. There's a certain resilience in it, a gritty reality that modern convenience has removed from our understanding of human history. By the time you leave the garderobe, your legs stiff and your cloak damp from either sweat or rain, you appreciate the ingenuity and suffering intertwined in medieval life. Cold stone, heat, drafts, and pests were constant. You've already learned about the physical discomfort of clothing and the awkward logistics of chamber pots. Now the seasonal extremes round out the picture. Nature itself conspiring to make even basic survival a complicated endeavor. You walk down the corridor, the wind at your back, thinking about the grand castles and the mighty lords who presided over them. You imagine them enduring the same drafts, the same heat, the same discomfort, and suddenly the distance of centuries shrinks. For a moment you feel connected to the human struggle of the past, a shared experience of bodily discomfort that transcends time. And as the castle settles into evening silence, you understand something important. Medieval toilets weren't just about waste disposal. They were about human endurance, about learning to survive in imperfect conditions, about facing the elements while performing the most private of tasks. It's a small, often overlooked window into daily life, one that combines the absurd with the essential, the humiliating with the necessary. You take a deep breath, stepping away from the drafty window, smiling faintly at the thought of modern toilets. And yet you can't help but feel a twinge of admiration for the people who faced this every day, year after year, season after season. Cold winters, hot summers, wind, rain, and snow, they endured it all, with the faint hope that one day, maybe, someone in the future would look back and chuckle at their struggles.
You've endured drafts, heat, rain, and cumbersome clothing, and now it's time to consider another medieval toilet challenge: the sheer variety of human waste disposal methods outside of the castle. You step beyond fortified walls into villages and farmlands, and the scene changes dramatically. Here, conveniences like garderobes and chamber pots are rare or non-existent. Instead, the countryside relies on ditches, trenches, and open fields, solutions that modern sensibilities would find shocking. You wander down a muddy path between thatched cottages, livestock milling about, chickens pecking, and puddles mixed with, well, everything. In these villages, human waste often ends up in simple pits or ditches behind homes. Privacy is minimal. There's no cold stone seat or wooden plank to perch upon. You squat over a hole in the dirt, gripping your cloak against the chill or wind. Scholars still argue whether villagers viewed this as shameful or just an ordinary everyday activity. Either way, it's a far cry from the noble settings you visited in castles. Oddly enough, even in such humble circumstances, some care was taken. You notice small wooden fences, low walls or thickets meant to shield the user from curious eyes. These were not grand architectural solutions. They were practical attempts at modesty. You step carefully, mindful of mud and the occasional stray animal, and realize that medieval people had to improvise constantly. Their toilet experience was raw, messy, and intensely practical. Now, think about children. Unlike in towns or castles, where chamber pots or garderobes might be available, rural kids often learned quickly to use the field, the ditch, or a small hole in the ground. You picture yourself trying to keep modesty while squatting over a shallow pit, training your aim, avoiding rocks or roots, and somehow maintaining dignity. It's a lesson in both survival and humility, one that modern toilet training can't fully replicate. And then there's the seasonal factor again. Rain transforms dirt pits into mudslides. Freezing winter turns them into icy hazards, and summer heat makes them unbearably aromatic. You step cautiously, imagining villagers dealing with these extremes on a daily basis. Scholars still debate whether the choice of pit location prioritized drainage, distance from homes, or just convenience. From where you stand, it seems like all three played a role, none entirely successfully. Let's add an odd detail. Some villagers used straw or moss to absorb moisture in their holes. It sounds quaint, almost cozy, but really it's just another adaptation to an unpleasant reality. You lean down, imagining the layers of straw under your hand, wondering how anyone could maintain such a setup without it quickly becoming another source of odor. This was survival ingenuity at its simplest, making the least comfortable options slightly more bearable. Animals complicate matters further. Livestock roam freely in the same fields and streets. Chickens scratch at the ground, pigs wallow in mud, and dogs dart about. You step carefully, aware that human waste and animal waste intermingle, creating a complex organic environment. Scholars still argue whether such proximity was considered unhygienic or simply unavoidable. Either way, the smell is undeniable. You wrinkle your nose, thinking how medieval villagers must have accepted it as normal, a necessary part of life. And yet, these simple disposal methods weren't entirely haphazard. Villagers often dug latrine pits downhill or downstream from wells and homes, understanding instinctively that some separation from water sources was important. It wasn't science as we know it, but it was practical observation and experience. You imagine the first villager noticing sickness or foul water and thinking, perhaps the pit should go over there, away from the spring. Small lessons learned painfully over time. And you also notice how human waste was often recycled. Manure mixed with straw or ash became fertilizer for crops. You step carefully through a patch of farmland, visualizing centuries of villagers using human waste as part of their survival strategy. Scholars still debate the safety of these methods, but in a time before modern sanitation, every bit of nutrients counted. What today seems disgusting was once considered essential for life itself. Oddly enough, the simplicity of village toilets brings a kind of stark honesty. There's no fancy name, no drafty chamber, no awkward seating arrangement. It's straightforward. You relieve yourself where you must, deal with the consequences, and move on. It's efficient, if brutal. You could almost admire the lack of pretense compared to castles, where names like garderobe tried to make filth sound noble. Out here, life is unvarnished. By the time you leave the village, your shoes coated in mud, your cloak damp with dew, you realize that medieval toilets were a spectrum. Castles had cold, awkward garderobes. Towns had crowded public privies and chamber pots. Villages had raw, practical pits and fields. Each solution reflects the resources, priorities, and daily realities of the people who lived there. And in each case, human ingenuity shines through. Adaptations to discomfort, drafts, smell, and social norms. As you wander back toward the castle for the evening, the countryside fading behind you, you reflect on the resilience required to survive. Every level of society faced challenges, whether it was balancing layers of clothing over a garderobe, dodging neighbors in a town privy, or navigating mud and animal waste in a rural pit. Medieval people were constantly negotiating the tension between biology, comfort, and society. You step back into the stone walls, your cloak clinging damply to your skin, grateful for the relative comfort of the castle and even the flawed garderobe. And yet, a part of you can't help but smile at the raw, practical ingenuity of villagers. Their toilets might have been simple, messy, and odorous, but they worked. Survival required nothing less. You realize that history isn't just about battles and kings. It's also about clay pots, straw, and the small victories over human necessity that shaped daily life for centuries. You've seen the wide spectrum of medieval toilets, from noble garderobes to rural pits, and now your journey takes you into a surprisingly grim and fascinating corner: disease and sanitation. Nature calls are not just uncomfortable. In the Middle Ages, they could be dangerous. You step into a courtyard, feeling the sun on the stones, and remember that human waste carried more than odor. It carried microbes long before anyone knew what microbes were. Think of the Black Death, the bubonic plague that swept Europe in the 14th century. The connection between waste and illness wasn't fully understood, but some townspeople noticed correlations. Streets littered with garbage, overflowing privies, stagnant water, all created perfect breeding grounds for fleas, lice, and bacteria. Scholars still argue how much contemporary people realized about these dangers versus relying on superstition.
Either way, you can imagine the tension. One misstep could mean sickness, not just embarrassment. Now, picture yourself walking past a town privy in summer. The flies swarm thickly, buzzing in ears, landing on every exposed surface. The smell is potent. You take a careful step back, mindful of slipping into a puddle of something unidentifiable. You notice rats scurrying across beams, peeking into open windows, and you shiver. They carry disease, but there's little anyone can do. Life is messy, and hygiene is a constant struggle. And it wasn't just rats or flies. Overflowing cesspits meant that human waste could seep into water sources. Wells, streams, and ponds sometimes became contaminated. Villagers unknowingly drank this water, using it for cooking, washing, and even bathing. Scholars still debate how much disease spread from contaminated water versus flea-borne illness, but one fact is clear. Waste management was critical to survival, and it was handled imperfectly at best. In castles, the situation was no safer. Even though garderobes kept waste off living floors, the shafts often emptied into moats, rivers, or open pits. This was convenient for disposing of matter, but disastrous for hygiene. You imagine a knight drawing water from a nearby stream for morning ablutions, completely unaware that the waste of dozens, maybe hundreds, had flowed through that same water. The irony isn't lost. You can't help but shudder and laugh at the unfortunate synchronicity of necessity. Odd details appear here too. Some medieval texts advised adding sand, ashes, or lime to pits to reduce smell or accelerate decomposition. You picture yourself sprinkling ashes into a cesspit like a medieval DIY project, imagining centuries of trial and error. Scholars still argue whether these methods truly improved health or just masked odors. Either way, humans were inventive, trying to tame what was fundamentally untamable. And hygiene went beyond toilets. You noticed hand-washing rituals among monks and nobles, often performed before meals or prayers. Without soap as we know it, water alone did little to remove pathogens. Still, there was a sense that washing mattered, that ritual cleanliness mattered. You picture yourself dipping fingers into a basin, waving them in the air, and hoping for the best. It's a small comfort, a tiny victory against an invisible enemy. Think about travel. Merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, anyone moving between towns faced extraordinary challenges. Public toilets varied wildly, chamber pots weren't always available, and open fields could be treacherous. Illness traveled as easily as people, and sometimes you could trace outbreaks along major trade routes. Scholars still argue whether quarantine methods were effective or purely symbolic, but it's clear that sanitation, or the lack of it, was intertwined with survival. And children? Their exposure to unsanitary conditions was daily. Playing in streets, helping with livestock, using open pits, every moment carried risk. You bend down, imagining yourself as a small child navigating mud, manure, and occasional puddles of waste. It's chaotic, dangerous, and yet ordinary. The human body adapts, but the risks were very real. Even in noble households, servants faced dangers. Emptying chamber pots, cleaning garderobes, handling waste-laden buckets, they were on the front lines of hygiene. Your imagination places you in the shoes of a servant, hauling a barrel full of human waste down cold stone steps. Every movement risks spillage. Every spill carries germs. Every day is a negotiation between survival and dignity. Despite all this, medieval people persevered. They learned practical solutions, location choices, adding ash to pits, separating waste from water, using herbs to mask smell, and establishing rudimentary laws about sanitation. You walk down a castle corridor thinking of centuries of people quietly solving these problems with limited resources. It's a testament to resilience. And as you stand in the courtyard, observing the layered complexity of waste management from village pits to castle garderobes, you realize that medieval toilets weren't just about discomfort or humor. They were about survival, about ingenuity, about confronting the messy realities of life. They remind you that even something as basic as relieving oneself has profound implications for health, social order, and daily living. You smile faintly, considering the absurdity and gravity together. Flies, rats, disease, overflow, drafts, heat, and winter chill, they were all part of this world. Yet humans endured, adapted, and even sometimes thrived. The lesson is clear. Discomfort and risk are woven into history in ways we often overlook. And toilets, simple, messy, and essential, offer one of the clearest windows into human ingenuity and resilience. You've explored castles, towns, villages, and the interplay of hygiene and disease. But now it's time to wander into the most creatively absurd aspect of medieval toilets, the inventive, yet often bizarre contraptions people attempted. You step into a quiet castle tower, imagining yourself perched atop a garderobe, and realize that human ingenuity often collided with the grim realities of waste management in delightfully weird ways. Consider the perching throne concept. Nobles sometimes commissioned wooden seats with intricately carved designs. You lean back against the wall, picturing a polished oak seat adorned with lions, gargoyles, or floral motifs. It sounds luxurious, almost regal, but you soon realize the irony. Beneath the carving, the hole is still a hole, the waste still drops downward, and the cold draft is merciless. Scholars still argue whether these designs were meant to impress visitors or simply to make an unpleasant act feel more dignified. Either way, it's hard not to smile at the juxtaposition of artistry and necessity. Some castles tried more mechanical solutions. You imagine pulleys, levers, and rudimentary drainage systems that allowed waste to drop further away from living quarters. In theory, this reduces odor and improves sanitation. In practice, a misaligned pulley or clogged chute could create chaos. Picture yourself pulling a lever to flush the garderobe, only to hear a splash, a thud, and perhaps even a yelp from below. You step carefully, realizing that invention in this context was high-stakes experimentation. Now, think about double-decker garderobes. Some castles stacked toilets, one above the other, allowing more people to use the facility simultaneously. Efficiency? Absolutely. Comfort? Debatable. You picture the unlucky occupant on the lower level enduring not only cold drafts, but also the occasional splash from above. Scholars still argue whether this was primarily a space-saving measure or just a clever, if risky, solution. Either way, it's a vivid reminder that medieval architects weren't shy about pushing limits, even if it meant a very messy consequence for someone. And here's an odd detail. Some garderobes featured luxury wooden seats that could swivel or pivot slightly. The aim was to make sitting more comfortable and possibly reduce contact with drafts. You imagine trying to balance on a swivel seat while wearing layers of wool, struggling to maintain dignity and avoid mishaps. It's both amusing and horrifying. You almost want to cheer for the brave souls who dared to test these contraptions. Water closets were extremely rare, but in some monasteries and high-status households, channels of running water were used to carry away waste. You step closer to a small stream flowing beneath the castle, imagining a medieval toilet connected to it. The principle is sound, the execution variable. Flooding, odor, and mechanical failure were frequent hazards. Scholars still debate whether these early experiments were widely successful or more symbolic demonstrations of status and innovation. You can see both sides, clever thinking paired with very human messiness. Traveling away from castles, you see that the inventive streak continues in towns. Public privies sometimes featured partitions carved with simple patterns or symbols to guide users to their seats. You picture yourself approaching one, confused about which side to choose, while someone nearby hums a tune. Oddly, even minimal privacy was considered an achievement. Scholars still argue whether these decorations were purely aesthetic or intended to create a sense of personal space in a communal setting. Either way, the thought makes you grin. In villages, innovation took a rougher, more pragmatic form. Simple wooden boards with holes could be moved over pits, sometimes with rudimentary lids or coverings. Ashes, straw, and moss were added to aid decomposition or absorb moisture. You crouch, imagining yourself attempting such a setup, shivering in winter or swatting flies in summer. The methods are crude, but effective. People adapted to the resources available, combining practicality with the barest touches of comfort. Animals, again, complicate things. Cats and dogs sometimes frequented latrines to scavenge, while birds perched nearby. You step carefully, imagining a medieval villager trying to navigate a pit while animals add their own unpredictable elements. Scholars still debate the extent to which animals contributed to sanitation problems versus simply being a nuisance. Either way, it adds an unexpected layer of challenge and humor to the story. And then there's the cultural layer. Some countries experimented with different materials: ceramic pots, wooden seats, metal fittings. Design varied widely by region, social class, and available materials. You examine a mock-up of a ceramic chamber pot, imagining the care required to clean it, the precision needed to place it correctly, and the discomfort of sitting on cold clay during winter. Scholars still argue whether ceramics were purely functional or a status symbol for wealthier households. Either way, they highlight the creativity applied to a basic human need. Even etiquette manuals attempted to provide guidance. You can almost hear a scribe's voice saying, "Do not spill, do not offend your neighbor, keep modesty intact." In practice, following these instructions was more complicated than writing them. You step back and imagine centuries of people trying, failing, adapting, and laughing, or cursing, through trial and error. The ingenuity and frustration are intertwined in every seat, every pit, every pipe. And finally, you realize that this creative chaos reflects human resilience. From carved wooden thrones to clever drainage systems, medieval people refused to accept discomfort passively. They invented, improvised, and experimented, often with humorous or messy results. You stand in the tower, imagining generations of users balancing dignity, survival, and innovation. It's a vivid testament to the human capacity to find solutions in the most uncomfortable circumstances. You leave the tower smiling faintly, aware that even the worst toilet designs show a spark of ingenuity and a touch of humor. Medieval toilets were not just functional. They were a playground of creative problem-solving, a space where necessity inspired both frustration and inventiveness. And as you descend the stone stairs, the wind whistling through gaps in the walls, you appreciate that these odd inventions are a quirky yet vital part of history.
You've explored ingenious toilet inventions, and now it's time to consider the social and cultural side of medieval sanitation. Toilets weren't just practical, they were woven into daily life, etiquette, and even humor. You wander down a bustling medieval street, imagining the mix of smells, voices, and activity, and realize that human waste played a larger role in society than you might expect. In towns, public privies were social spaces, albeit the most awkward ones imaginable. You lean against a wooden partition, hearing murmurs, laughter, and occasional groans. People shared stories while perched over holes, exchanged gossip, or scolded children. Scholars still argue whether communal toilets were primarily about efficiency or social interaction. Either way, it's clear that human necessity forced people into shared, intimate experiences they wouldn't otherwise choose. You notice signs of etiquette. In more crowded privies, Users were expected to keep quiet or speak softly. The act of sitting together created a strange form of social contract. You imagine yourself trying to concentrate while someone 2 seats away hums a tune or coughs violently. The balance between privacy, modesty, and necessity is delicate. Scholars still debate whether these rules were universally followed or merely aspirational ideals. Either way, it's a fascinating glimpse into social norms shaped by human biology. Odd details emerge too. Some towns decorated privy walls with humorous carvings or inscriptions, from simple jokes to crude sketches. You squint at the stone, seeing what might be medieval graffiti, a reminder that humor and human nature persist even in the worst circumstances. Imagine laughing quietly at a crude joke while perched on a cold plank, hoping no one notices. Even in discomfort, people found ways to connect, amuse, or survive mentally. The hierarchy of users is another consideration. Nobles, merchants, and commoners often had access to different facilities, reflecting social class. You imagine stepping into a noble's private garderobe, polished wooden seat and carved walls offering dignity, while commoners in the same town line up at an exposed public latrine. Scholars still argue whether class differences in sanitation affected health outcomes significantly. Either way, the contrast highlights social inequality in the most literal sense. In monasteries, the social rules took a unique form. Monks shared communal latrines, often in long rows with minimal privacy. Silence was mandated, conversation was discouraged. You picture cloaked figures sieving side by side, stoic, disciplined, perhaps whispering prayers to endure the unpleasantness. Scholars still debate whether this enforced silence was religious devotion or simply a practical measure to reduce noise and embarrassment. Either way, the image is strikingly vivid and oddly relatable. And children again enter the picture. In towns and villages, kids often helped family members clean or maintain waste areas. You imagine a small child carrying a bucket of waste through muddy streets, dodging chickens and puddles, learning the harsh realities of sanitation early. Oddly, humor persists here too. Kids would play near latrines, teetering dangerously on planks, inventing games out of necessity. Scholars still debate the role of early exposure in shaping practical skills versus social norms. Either way, it's both fascinating and slightly horrifying. Travelers added complexity. Inns and way stations often had communal privies, sometimes outside, sometimes above streams. You imagine a weary merchant trudging to the latrine after a long day, balancing urgency, modesty, and personal dignity. The risk of contamination, slips, or awkward encounters is high. Scholars still argue whether these facilities were truly improved over time or simply tolerated as part of the journey. Either way, medieval travel was a full-body sensory experience in every way, not least through toilets. Seasonal effects also shaped social behavior. In winter, icy or frozen privies could force people to wait longer, leading to impatience and occasional accidents. In summer, heat, flies, and odor tested patience. You picture townspeople adapting rituals, carrying personal herbs, or timing their use strategically. Even something as simple as relieving oneself required planning, observation, and adaptability. Scholars still debate how much these practices influenced daily routines, but the human ingenuity involved is clear. Odd quirks persist in popular culture too. Literature, plays, and satirical poems often referenced toilets, hygiene, and bodily functions. You imagine scribes composing humorous lines about a clumsy nobleman, a leaky chamber pot, or a child's misadventure. Humor, embarrassment, and social norms intersected in ways that were entertaining yet grounded in daily reality. Scholars still analyze these texts to understand medieval attitudes towards hygiene, modesty, and bodily functions. You notice that etiquette, humor, and improvisation intersected constantly. People had to navigate social norms while managing very practical bodily needs. The act of using a toilet was not purely private. It was embedded in class, ritual, season, and communal expectations. You imagine yourself participating, balancing dignity with necessity, and suddenly history feels alive, messy, and deeply human. By the time you leave the town street, the smells lingering faintly, you realize that medieval toilets were much more than furniture or pits. They were social hubs, learning spaces, sites of humor, markers of class, and crucibles of adaptation. They shaped how people interacted, how children learned, how travelers survived, and how humor and creativity thrived under difficult circumstances. You can't help but smile at the complexity, realizing that something as basic as human waste had profound cultural implications. And as you step into the evening chill, reflecting on centuries of social norms, awkward interactions, and inventive coping strategies, you understand something important. Medieval toilets were not just a test of patience and resilience. They were a mirror of human society itself. Each plank, pit, or privy tells a story of ingenuity, embarrassment, survival, and social cohesion. Even in the foulest situations, people adapted, laughed, taught, and endured. You draw a deep breath, letting the mix of history, odor, and human resilience settle. There's a strange comfort in knowing that while life was messy, medieval people approached it with resourcefulness, humor, and practicality. You smile faintly, thinking of centuries of laughter echoing faintly through stone halls, fields, and crowded town streets. Proof that even in the worst of circumstances, life continues, humans adapt, and history quietly unfolds.
You've explored social aspects, humor, and ingenuity, but now it's time to dive into another surprisingly tricky aspect: medieval waste disposal during festivals and large gatherings. You wander through a medieval fairground, tents pitched, merchants shouting, musicians playing, and the smell of food mingling with, well, human necessity. Toilets were not designed for crowds, and this is where chaos truly reigns. Picture a summer festival with hundreds, maybe thousands of attendees. Merchants display goods, children run, livestock roam, and travelers have just arrived after days on the road. You follow a group toward a nearest privy, or what passes for one, only to find a row of wooden planks, gaps between them, and a pit below. You lean forward, imagining the line of people waiting, sweating, shifting uncomfortably. Scholars still argue how medieval organizers attempted to manage sanitation during events versus simply relying on open spaces and luck. Either way, it's clear that large crowds tested every ingenuity of waste management. The oddity is that some towns tried rudimentary planning. Temporary latrines were erected, often wooden structures with straw or moss lining, and in some cases, buckets were used to carry waste away. You picture yourself stepping carefully on a wooden plank, balancing layers of clothing, and hoping the structure holds. Scholars still debate the effectiveness of these temporary measures. Did they prevent disease or merely delay the inevitable stench? Either way, it's a fascinating glimpse into human improvisation. Now, imagine the sensory experience. You hear laughter and music, smell roasting meat and fresh bread, and then a sudden whiff of less pleasant aromas rises from the latrine area. Flies buzz thickly, and children's laughter mixes with occasional groans of discomfort. You step back, shaking your head at the chaotic blend of joy and survival. Medieval festivals were vibrant, alive, and messy in every sense of the word. Animals complicate matters further. Horses and donkeys pulling carts, livestock in pens, stray dogs and chickens all contribute to the mix of smells and hygiene challenges. You navigate carefully, imagining festival goers dodging piles of waste while still trying to enjoy the fair. Scholars still argue whether the presence of animals significantly exacerbated sanitation issues or simply added to the sensory chaos. Either way, it's an unavoidable experience. Food and drink present another challenge. Spilled ale, breadcrumbs, and roasted meat interact with human waste in unpredictable ways. You step over a puddle that might be something worse than ale, grimacing slightly. Scholars still debate whether food contamination was a major source of outbreaks during festivals or whether other factors like crowd density played a larger role. You decide it's best not to linger over the specifics. And hygiene rituals? Forget about them here. There's little opportunity for hand washing, and soap is rare. Travelers and townspeople alike make do with water from a nearby stream or basin, often insufficient to remove microbes or odor. You picture yourself dipping hands hastily, the cool water doing little to alleviate discomfort. The balance between enjoying the festival and surviving the sanitation hazards is delicate at best. Oddly enough, humor emerges again. Bards and jesters often reference these shared human experiences, making jokes about awkward moments, overflowing buckets, and mishaps during the festival. You chuckle quietly, imagining someone slipping on a plank or narrowly avoiding a spill while a crowd laughs and groans in unison. Humor, embarrassment, and survival intermingle seamlessly in these chaotic settings. Children, once more, play a unique role. They dart around freely, sometimes balancing on planks, sometimes testing the limits of temporary structures, and often learning survival skills quickly. You crouch imagining a child learning to navigate mud, straw, and unsteady boards, all while keeping up with the festive excitement. Scholars still debate how these experiences shaped practical knowledge versus social norms. But one thing is clear: medieval festivals were training grounds for both resilience and ingenuity. Even noble visitors weren't immune. High-status attendees faced the same crowds, the same heat, and the same makeshift latrines, albeit with slightly improved accommodations. You picture a lord balancing dignity, clothing layers, and urgency while navigating the festival grounds. Scholars still argue whether nobles suffered less or simply adapted better. Either way, it highlights that no one, regardless of status, could escape the realities of human biology. The lessons extend beyond hygiene. Festivals show the intersection of survival, social interaction, humor, and ingenuity. People adapted to crowds, animals, weather, and waste simultaneously. You move carefully through the fairground, considering the layers of complexity: practical, social, and human. Even something as basic as using a toilet becomes a reflection of communal life, creativity, and resilience. As the sun sets and the festival winds down, you notice small triumphs. Temporary latrines worked, children learned quickly, and humor eased discomfort. You breathe in the evening air, a mix of food, hay, and finally less offensive odors, realizing that medieval people managed to find joy even in challenging conditions. Toilets were messy, yes, but life persisted. Adaptation and ingenuity were constant companions, and humor softened the sharp edges of daily survival. By the time you leave the fairground, tired but entertained, you understand that festivals encapsulate the essence of medieval sanitation: unpredictable, challenging, inventive, and deeply human. Toilets weren't just functional, they were woven into social life, teaching, improvising, and even comedy. And as you step into the twilight, the sounds of laughter and distant music lingering, you carry a profound respect for the resilience and creativity of the people who navigated these chaotic spaces with courage, humor, and ingenuity. You've journeyed through castles, villages, towns, and even festival grounds. But now it's time to confront perhaps the most personal aspect of medieval toilets: privacy, or more accurately, the lack thereof. You wander down a narrow corridor in a castle tower, imagining yourself needing relief, and realize that medieval people often had to perform one of the most private acts in highly public or exposed settings. In castles, guardrobes offered a degree of seclusion but not total privacy. Thin wooden doors, gaps in stone walls, and shared facilities meant that sounds, smells, and movements could easily be perceived. You perch over a stone seat, imagining someone outside pacing or even peeking through gaps. Scholars still argue whether nobles truly valued privacy or simply tolerated occasional exposure as part of daily life. Either way, you feel a mix of empathy and amusement for anyone trying to maintain dignity. In towns, public privies were often cramped, communal, and lacking in partitions. You step cautiously, imagining a long bench with multiple holes, each occupied by someone trying to focus while enduring discomfort. Conversation is minimal, laughter occasional, and the atmosphere thick with shared humanity. Scholars still debate whether these communal spaces fostered social bonding or simply enforced tolerance of awkward circumstances. Either way, it's clear that medieval privacy was nothing like modern expectations. Odd details appear again. In some towns, privies were elevated over streams or canals, creating both efficiency and exposure. You lean forward, picturing the water rushing below, the sounds amplified, the smells mixing with damp air. Scholars still argue whether the visual exposure mattered less than the olfactory one, or vice versa. Either way, it's a vivid reminder that medieval life required a constant negotiation between necessity and modesty. In villages, privacy was often entirely absent. Fields, ditches, and open pits meant that people performed nature's call where they must. You crouch over a hole, surrounded by tall grass or straw, imagining anyone walking by could witness the act. Children, animals, and neighbors all contribute to a lack of discretion. Scholars still debate whether people adapted psychologically, treating it as normal, or whether it caused constant embarrassment. Either way, the reality is humbling. Survival trumps privacy. You notice a peculiar paradox. Attempts to improve privacy often increased complexity. Lids, partitions, raised platforms indoors were meant to provide seclusion, but also added physical difficulty. You imagine balancing on a raised plank, maneuvering layers of clothing, and trying not to let a misstep expose you. Scholars still argue whether such innovations truly enhanced comfort or merely shifted the challenge elsewhere. Either way, human ingenuity shines through, even if it produces comical results. Seasonal factors again influence privacy. In winter, snow and ice could reveal footprints, inadvertently exposing location. In summer, leaves or reeds might rustle, giving away a user's presence. You imagine yourself glancing nervously at surrounding vegetation, hoping for discretion while enduring the act. Scholars still debate whether environmental awareness was taught, learned by necessity, or simply a matter of instinct. Either way, it's a skill you quietly respect. Children learned early to navigate these constraints. They observed adults, understood social rules, and adapted to open or semi-private toilets. You picture a small child balancing on a plank, crouching behind a fence, learning both the mechanics and the subtle social rules. Humor and embarrassment are intertwined, shaping lessons that extend far beyond bodily functions. Scholars still debate whether early exposure made children resilient or perpetuated discomfort. Either way, adaptation was essential. Oddly, humor was a coping mechanism. Literature, songs, and oral jokes often reference embarrassment, missteps, or awkward moments during toilet use. You chuckle quietly, imagining a clumsy nobleman caught mid-action, a servant snickering from outside, and the inevitable ripple of laughter. Humor, embarrassment, and shared humanity intersect here more clearly than anywhere else. Scholars still analyze these references to understand medieval attitudes toward privacy, dignity, and humor. Travelers faced compounded challenges. Inns and way stations often had communal facilities, and new faces increased the risk of exposure. You step carefully through a wooden platform above a pit, imagining a merchant from a distant town enduring both the mechanics and the social awkwardness. Scholars still argue whether such exposure encouraged etiquette, humor, or rapid adaptation. Either way, it highlights that privacy was often a luxury, not a given. Even nobles weren't immune. Private guardrobes reduced risk, but in crowded castles or during sieges, exposure increased dramatically. You imagine a lord attempting to preserve dignity while urgency presses, servants nearby, and sounds echoing down stone corridors. Scholars still debate whether nobles valued privacy over convenience or status. Either way, the effort required is clear. As you wander through these varied settings, you notice a pattern. Privacy was never absolute. Medieval toilets demanded adaptation, observation, and resilience. Humor and social rules helped, but physical and environmental constraints were constant. You smile faintly, realizing that this constant negotiation between necessity, dignity, social norms, and environment is a defining feature of medieval sanitation. By the time you leave the corridor, the chill of stone behind you, you understand something profound. Medieval toilets reveal human adaptation in the face of exposure, discomfort, and social constraint. They reflect the tension between basic biology and societal expectations, and they offer lessons in patience, observation, and humor. Even centuries later, the challenges remain relatable. Everyone must balance urgency with dignity, whether in a castle tower, a town privy, or a village pit. You take a deep breath, feeling the weight of centuries of human experience settling around you. Privacy may have been scarce, but resilience, adaptation, and humor abounded. And as you step into the evening air, the distant sounds of people, animals, and wind blending together, you carry a newfound appreciation for the medieval struggle. Uncomfortable, messy, often absurd, but deeply human.
You've explored castles, villages, towns, festivals, and privacy challenges, and now it's time to tie it all together by looking at the lasting legacy of medieval toilets. You wander slowly through a quiet castle ruin, imagining centuries of people perched on stone and wood, dealing with cold drafts, heat, odors, and social conventions. You realize that these uncomfortable, often ridiculous solutions shaped not just daily life, but also human ingenuity and resilience. Consider how early sanitation informed later developments. Though medieval toilets were far from perfect, they laid the groundwork for future plumbing innovations. You picture engineers centuries later studying castle guardrobes or town privies, understanding how gravity-fed shafts, drainage channels, and rudimentary plumbing could evolve into more sophisticated systems. Scholars still debate how much medieval experimentation influenced later inventions, but there's no doubt that these early attempts demonstrated problem-solving in extreme conditions. Oddly, humor persists in legacy too. Even today, writers, historians, and YouTubers find medieval toilets hilarious, using them as a window into human nature. You chuckle imagining a modern reenactor perched on a replica guardrobe, trying not to slip, feeling the cold stone, and learning firsthand what life was like. Humor and absurdity remain as much a part of the story as hygiene and practicality. Environmental awareness also emerges from these designs. Waste was often directed away from living spaces, rivers, and fields, showing early recognition of the dangers of contamination. You imagine villagers carefully choosing pit locations, monks lining latrine floors with straw or moss, and noblemen insisting on channels to carry waste downstream. Scholars still debate how intentional these choices were versus accidental, but the results had clear practical impact: less contamination, fewer odors, and a slightly safer environment. You notice that innovation often came from necessity. Cold winters demanded solutions for comfort, hot summers required ventilation, and crowded festivals forced improvisation. You step carefully across a stone courtyard, imagining centuries of trial, error, and adaptation. Medieval toilets reflect human creativity responding to both environmental and social pressures.
Each plank, pit, or gutter tells a story of people making the best of uncomfortable circumstances. And social norms leave their mark as well. Class, etiquette, humor, and shared experience intertwined with sanitation practices. You picture noblemen balancing dignity, children learning survival, servants managing messy tasks, and villagers improvising with straw, moss, and buckets. Scholars still analyze these practices to understand how society organized itself around human necessity. You realize that toilets were more than infrastructure. They were mirrors of society itself. The educational aspect is striking. Children, apprentices, and travelers all learned practical skills while navigating these environments. You crouch for a moment, imagining a small child balancing on a plank or learning to use a communal privy, acquiring skills of balance, discretion, and improvisation. Humor and embarrassment were teachers as much as practical instruction. Scholars still debate how these lessons influenced adulthood, but adaptation was clear. Odd innovations survive in cultural memory, too. Carved wooden seats, graffiti, jokes, poems, and literature all immortalize the human struggle with waste. You imagine a medieval bard composing a humorous verse about a clumsy nobleman or an overflowing pit. These stories blend humor, survival, and social commentary, reminding you that even the most mundane necessities were deeply human and culturally significant. Travelers, too, carried lessons far and wide. Inns, way stations, and trade routes spread ideas about sanitation, privacy, and temporary solutions. You imagine a weary merchant moving between towns, comparing latrines, learning which techniques reduced odor, minimized flies, or preserved dignity. Scholars still debate how much this knowledge circulated versus remaining localized, but the practical exchange of ideas was clearly happening. By the time you walk through the empty castle corridors, the sun setting and wind whispering through gaps in stone, you feel the weight of centuries of human adaptation. Cold winters, hot summers, flies, odor, privacy challenges, social norms, festivals, and invention all converge in a tapestry of resilience, ingenuity, and humor. Medieval toilets were not just functional, they were cultural, social, and even educational institutions, albeit uncomfortable ones. And so you pause, reflecting on what you've learned. From drafty garderobes to village pits, from temporary festival latrines to ingenious inventions, from social norms to humor and adaptation, medieval toilets reveal the extraordinary human capacity to endure, adapt, and innovate. They remind you that history isn't only about kings, battles, and treaties. It's also about cold stone, flies, straw, and the universal, humbling act of relieving oneself. You take a deep breath, stepping into the evening air, the castle ruins silent around you. You feel a connection to every person who lived through these experiences, marveling at their resilience, creativity, and humor. And as you walk slowly into the twilight, you realize something profound. Even in discomfort and mess, life persisted. People adapted, laughed, learned, and endured. And so do we, centuries later, through the stories they left behind. You've journeyed through centuries of stone, wood, and straw, imagining the cold drafts of castle garderobes, the bustling chaos of town privies, the muddy pits of villages, and the hectic disorder of festival latrines. Now it's time to let your mind drift, easing from the intensity of human necessity into the quiet rhythm of history itself. You lean against a cool stone wall, feeling the soft evening breeze, the faint hum of distant water, and the gentle rustle of leaves above. Imagine the smells fading, the flies gone, the awkwardness of exposure softened by time. You picture children playing safely in the fields, travelers resting peacefully after a long journey, and nobles finally enjoying a quiet, warm evening. Humor lingers, gentle and familiar, reminding you that even in discomfort, humans found ways to laugh. The world feels calmer, lighter, as if centuries of challenges have settled into quiet lessons of resilience and adaptation. You close your eyes, letting the sounds of the medieval world transform into whispers, a gentle stream below a stone latrine shaft, the distant clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the faint murmur of conversation carried on the wind. Each detail, once urgent and messy, now becomes part of a soothing, rhythmic pattern. You can almost feel the warmth of a hearth, the soft scratch of straw, the quiet satisfaction of survival. As your thoughts wander further, you realize that medieval toilets were more than cold stone and unpleasant smells. They were a testament to human ingenuity, humor, and endurance. Each plank, pit, and privy is a story of people navigating discomfort with courage, learning, and adaptation. You smile faintly, feeling the connection across centuries and the quiet magic of ordinary life. So, let the evening hum surround you, the wind brushing softly, and sink gently into rest. Your mind can wander through history, laughter, and resilience. Sleep now, softly and deeply, knowing that humanity, messy, inventive, and resilient, has always found ways to endure. End of script. Sweet dreams.